Angelicus and its Hello and welcome to episode 64 of Spurbs Herbs. Today we're going to do a really interesting herb of the world. It's going to be Apple of Sodom, or Calotropis procera. And so without further ado, let's get into today's episode. As I said, we're going to be talking about Apple of Sodom, or Calotropis procera. This is a super interesting herb with biblical implications and some real toxicity for us to discuss. But can it be used medicinally? Since that is our mission, it's safe to assume it can be. And as usual, we will be exploring something a little different. We will be continuing our discussion of the Chinese medical pulse by discussing the first 6 pulse qualities. This is going to be a really interesting, well, they all are, but this one is going to have some religious significance in addition to medicinal significance. Please join us for this fascinating episode. Before we get going, I want to talk to you guys about the new series that I'm doing, which is Integrative Nutrition in Chinese Medicine. We started this new webinar series, and I wanted to let my podcast listeners know about it before anyone else. And it is Integrative Nutrition in Chinese Medicine. It will cover biomedical and Chinese concepts of nutrition and explore the complementary and alternative concepts that are part of the modern supplement industry. The series will be 1 live class per month covering a category of nutrition, and will include some basic biochemistry, nutrition, and supplements available on the market. In other words, it's going to be the perfect combination of biochemical nutrition, supplements, Chinese medicine, and real-world use cases. If you are a practitioner of any stripe or just interested in nutrition, this is the series for you. And you can sign up for the first class or the whole series at www.integrativemedicinecouncil.org. That's Integrative Medicine Council, COUNCIL.org. I will only be teaching each class live 1 time. I've done 2 so far. After that, it will only be available as a recording. So don't miss this opportunity to learn about a topic all our patients ask about and get a firm understanding of the basics of integrated nutrition. And I just want to add, this is really near and dear to my heart because I see so much wrong information out there. And having a strong background in the biochemistry of nutrition and all that, I just thought it was really important to put this together. And so I hope you guys can join me. Thank you. Okay, let's talk about our little something different today. In our last episode, we started discussing the Chinese medical pulse, examining how to take it, what it can tell us, and how complicated it can be. And it can be quite complicated. As I mentioned last episode, I said, look, I used to teach this, and I'd say to my students, look, I'm gonna teach you the basics of pulses, and you're gonna spend the rest of your life actually getting good at it. So it's a complicated endeavor. It's an ongoing pursuit. And we discussed that there are 28 different pulse qualities, so that's quite a few of them. In this episode, we're going to start talking about the first few and most basic of those qualities. So we're going to talk about 6 of the most basic pulse qualities: slow, fast, empty, full, floating, and deep. So let's start with that slow pulse, the slow or qi pulse. So CHI, I have to admit, my first Chinese teachers were Taiwanese, so they kind of put an on the end of I sound, so qi, but it really should probably be qi. Not the qi of the energy and stuff around our body, but a different tone, a different character. So the slow or qi pulse is when the pulse is slower than usual. Maciocia, remember we talked a little bit about Maciocia in the last episode. Maciocia is just a wonderful, wonderful person who wrote many of the basic textbooks for our profession. And one of those is The Foundations of Chinese Medicine, where I get a lot of today's information from. So it's a really great book. And he said, Giovanni Maciocia says, this pulse has 3 beats per respiration cycle of the practitioner. So remember, if you remember back to the last episode, we said the practitioner needs to regulate their breathing before taking the pulse properly. And this is one of the reasons for it, is that it's not the patient's respirations, it's the practitioners. The idea is that a practitioner is relatively healthy and should have nice balanced respiration. So let's use that as a marker for whether a pulse is slow or fast. So in the old times, this is going back to Machiosha's quote, in the old times, the rate was referred to the practitioner's respiration cycle, but nowadays the pulse rate can also be counted conventionally using a pulse. Using a watch. I also use a pulse ox, which is where I got the pulse from, which is just one of those little things that go over the finger and not only tells me the pulse rate, but also tells me their oxygen saturation. So, and they're cheap these days. So, the normal pulse rate changes per age. And he says, this is not exactly what Western medicine says, but what he says is 76 to 80 beats per minute is normal for 10 to 35-year-olds, 72 or 70 for 35 to 50-year-olds, and 68 beats per minute for over 50-year-olds. So it gets a little bit slower as we get older. Basically, and that's normal. So for it to be a slow pulse, it needs to be considerably less than that normal pulse. So basically, a slow pulse indicates a cold pattern, which can be further broken down with empty full pulses, as we are going to discuss. We're going to talk about both the empty and the full pulses. A slow and weak or empty pulse is empty cold, while a slow and full pulse is a full cold condition. This is basics of the slow pulse. Let's talk about the rapid pulse. These ones are easy, really. The slow and rapid for the most part. So the rapid or Shu pulse is faster than normal. So still use those normals, but now it needs to be quite a bit faster. Machiosha says the pulse has more than 5 beats per each respiration cycle, or has a higher rate than the ones indicated above. So 5 beats per respiration cycle again of the practitioner. So 3 and below is considered slow, 5 and above is considered fast. So 4 is where the magic normal would be if you look at the traditional approach to this. So a rapid pulse indicates a condition of heat. And just like in a cold pulse, a rapid empty pulse indicates empty or deficient heat, and a full and rapid pulse indicates a full heat pattern. I'm going to talk about these empty full conditions right now, so we kind of get an idea of what we mean by a full heat versus an empty heat, or a full cold versus an empty cold. So these empty and full conditions are very significant in Chinese medicine. Yin is the cooling aspect and yang the warming aspect of the body. That's really, they do a lot more than just cool and warm, but that's a primary function of yin and yang. So we're just focusing on that for right now. There's a lot more to it than this, but this gets us into to where we're going. A full cold condition indicates the yin is too much, or cooling, overly cooling, because there's too much of it there. That's a little controversial because yin, some people say you can't have too much yin or yang, and other people say you can. But relatively speaking, we can certainly say this, that the yin is too much. And a full heat condition indicates too much or too active yang. And the opposite applies. An empty cold pattern can be caused by too little yang to adequately warm, and an empty heat pattern can be caused by too little yin to adequately cool the body. So that's the difference, and they're treated very differently. So it's important to make these distinctions. So with this in mind, let's discuss the pulses that indicate empty and full conditions in general. So the first one is the empty pulse. So there is a pulse that's called empty. The slow and fast pulses can be measured and are very specific. And those are pretty much the only pulses that are like that. Every other pulse has some component of subjectiveness. And that applies to the empty or Shu pulse. Machiosha describes this. By the way, these words are Machiosha. He has his own translations of a lot of these pulses. So often you'll see the empty pulse as being deficient or vacuous pulse, not just empty. So there are other names, synonyms for these pulses as well. So Machiosha describes this pulse Thusly, the empty pulse feels rather big but soft. Empty may suggest that nothing can be felt, but this is not so. This pulse is actually rather big, but it feels empty on a slightly stronger pressure and is soft. This pulse indicates deficiency or vacuity of qi, the primal force in Chinese medicine. So that's the empty pulse. Let's talk about the full pulse. The full or sheer pulse, shi pulse. Again, I do that R sound, so I apologize for that. The full or shi pulse feels full, rather hard, and rather long. We're going to get into length later, not today, but rather long. Full is often used in two slightly different ways, according to, this is a quote from Maciocia. On the one hand, it indicates a specific type of pulse as described above. On the other hand, this term is often used to indicate any pulse of the full type. So there's a general full type, and there's very specific, hard, rather long, full. That is the full or shi pulse. The full pulse indicates a full pattern, just as we discussed with the full rapid and full slow pulses. So there you go. These pulses qualities can be combined into very specific diagnoses. Okay, so that's the empty full pulse. Let's talk about the next pairing of pulses. So we talked about slow and fast, so those are opposites. We talked about empty and full, those are opposites. And now we're going to talk about another opposite pair. And the first of that pair is called the floating pulse. The floating or fu pulse can be felt with a light pressure of the fingers, just resting the fingers on the artery. Again, while this sounds pretty straightforward, it can be somewhat subjective. Some people will say this is floating, others won't. You know, I used to say if you have, my joke is if you have 5 acupuncturists all commenting on the same pulse, you'll get 6 different pulses out of it. So there's always controversy. It's not often clean cut. There's subjectiveness, even to these basic qualities here. But these are easier than a lot of the other qualities we're going to be talking about. In general, this pulse indicates an exterior condition from an invasion of an exterior pathogenic factor or influence. Example of this is wind cold, which is floating and slow pulse, and wind heat, of floating and rapid pulse, both of these conditions. A floating and tight pulse can also indicate a wind cold pattern. We're not going to talk about tight for a while, but that's a different pulse quality as well. Maciocia also says this pulse can be present in interior conditions, and quoting from him, in interior conditions, if the pulse is floating at the superficial level but empty at the deep level, it indicates deficiency of yin. In rare cases, the pulse can be floating in other interior conditions such as anemia or cancer. In these cases, the pulse is floating because qi is very deficient and floats to the surface of the body. So that's a bad, in those rare cases, that is indicative of pretty serious conditions. Then we have the deep pulse. So this is the other side of the pair. So floating and deep pulses are the third pair that we're talking about today. And the deep or Chen pulse is the opposite of the floating pulse. Quote, it can only be felt with a heavy pressure of the fingers and is felt near the bone. That's the end of the quote. And just as a floating pulse indicates an exterior condition, the deep pulse indicates an interior condition, as well as indicating the problem is it can be with the yin or solid organs. Maciocia adds, if it is deep and weak, it indicates deficiency of qi and yang. If it is deep and full, it indicates stasis or blockage of qi or blood in the interior, or interior cold or heat. It can be both interior cold or heat with a deep and full pulse. So how would we tell the difference between cold and heat in this situation? Well, we time it. If it's a little bit slower, it's cold. If it's a little bit warmer, it's heat. So we just talked about all that. So these are the first 6 pulses: slow and fast, empty, full, floating, and deep. And they are pretty basic and foundational in Chinese medicine. Every pulse is usually initially assessed using these 6 parameters before determining other more complex and subjective pulse qualities. So, when I teach this, like, these are the first ones to feel for. Do this before you do anything else, because generally these first 6 qualities can be discerned quickly and accurately with a little practice. Other qualities, which we'll discuss over time, usually require much more experience and guidance with a proficient teacher to kind of explain, well, this is the slippery pulse, this is the tight pulse, that sort of stuff. And with this first step into the world of pulse qualities under our belt, let's discuss today's herb. And today's herb, as you should know from the title of today's episode, is called Apple of Sodom. And it is from the family of Apocynaceae, or dogbane family. We'll talk about why it has that name of dogbane. And there's one. When I looked up the specific species for this, they all were, except for one, and I'll talk about that in a second, they were all Calotropis procera. And what differed was the biologist names behind that. So one was Alton in parentheses and WT Alton, Eiton, I'm sorry, not Alton, Eiton, Aiton, Eiton in parentheses and WT Eiton loose. Now remember what that usually means in parentheses. It was the old biologist who discovered it, and then a new biologist kind of came along and put it in more classification. So that's usually the parentheses. So that was one of them. Another one had Eit period behind it, which is still Eiton. It's just a shortening of Eiton. One said L, which you can look up these shortened names, the abbreviations. They're all very standardized when it comes to these things. With dry end outside of the parentheses. One had wild in the parentheses, and R, BR period, R period, BR period outside of the parentheses. Again, all different biologists. And then one had the same thing. Instead of wild in parentheses, it had Eit period in parentheses and the RBR outside of the parentheses. And the one name that was a little bit different than this Calotropis procera, even though all the different biologist names might be different, was Asclepius procera, and that was attributed to Eiton without any other biologists involved, apparently. So these are all the species names. Now they're all synonyms. They're all the same species. These aren't different species saying this is this herb, which we will see on occasion. These are all just different attributions of the same name. And the medicinal part for this, according to Grunwald, who and his team et al., they wrote the PDR for herbal medicines. And they say the medicinal parts are the dried root and root bark, though Verma and their team, which is another paper, say most parts of the plant are used in medicine in different traditions. And as we look at this, we're going to see that almost all of the different parts of the plant are actually going to be used medicinally. Other names for Apple of Sodom, there's a lot of them here. And some of them not very different. So the first one is AK, A-A-K. The second one is AK, A-K, so it has one A gone. There's a Kata, a Larka, Arka. I think all of those are in the Ayurvedic and Hindu kind of realms of things. Asclepius, which we said was one of the names, it's the genus name, Asclepius procera. Auricula tree, cabbage tree, Calotrope, which is just a common way of saying Calotropis, crown flower, Dead Sea apple, king's crown, milkweed tree, rooster tree, rubber bush. There's actually, when we look at the contents, we won't really mention it, but when you do look at it, rubber is a significant part of the latex here. So rubber bush, rubber tree, madder, M-A-D-A-R, mutter bark, M-U-D-A-R. So I wonder if those are the same words, but just slightly different translations from a different language. Mutter, yercum, so that's M-U-D-E-R, yercum, Y-E-R-C-U-M. Instead of Apple of Sodom, Sodom apple, swallowwort. And then the last one I've seen in a couple places, and I think it's same word, but again, slightly different letters from the Arabic, which is Usher or Ashar, U-S-H-A-R or U-S-H-E-R. So those are all different names of the apple of Sodom, Calotropis procera. Let's talk about this Apocynaceae family real quick. I always like to just mention the family. So this is a family of flowering plants that includes trees, shrubs, herbs, stem succulents, and vines. So very varied as far as the family is concerned. As we mentioned, also known as the dogbane family because some of the plants are used as a dog poison. Many of these plants have milky latex, and many species are poisonous if ingested. The family being rich in genera containing alkaloids and cardiac glycosides. We're going to keep in mind those cardiac glycosides. We're going to talk about those later. Those containing the later often finding use as arrow poisons. So some of the native peoples will coat their arrows in this in order to kill people. There are about 376 genera in this family, and the leaves are usually simple and often in pairs. And several genera have pharmacologically useful constituents, such as those cardiac glycosides and reserpine, which is another drug as well. So the cardiac glycosides, we usually, if you think about an herb with cardiac glycosides, you think of foxglove. In fact, my grandfather, who was a doctor and very against herbs, he thought what I was doing was a little silly. But I'd remind him, he used to tell us the story when he was a young doctor. They used to go out behind the hospital and look and scrape off foxglove trees for their cardiac patients, and that's because of these cardiac glycosides. So according to the website Weeds of Australia, there are several distinguishing characteristics of this plant. It is a large shrub with waxy stems and leaves that contain a milky sap. It's relatively large grayish green leaves, 5 to 20 centimeters long and 4 to 10 centimeters wide. So for those of you in the US, that's anywhere from about 2 to 8 inches long and about 2 to 4 inches wide. So they're pretty broad leaves. Are borne in pairs and are stem clasping. Its flowers, 20 to 33 millimeters across, that's about an inch, give or take, have 5 petals that are white with purplish colored tips and a purplish crown-like center. They're beautiful if you saw the picture at the beginning of this podcast. Its fruit is a large 8 to 12 centimeters long, so 8 to 12 centimeters is about 3.5 to about 4.5 inches. Bladdery pod that is grayish green in color. This fruit splits open at maturity to release numerous seeds, each topped with a tuft of long white silky hairs. And these hairs become important, not necessarily medicinally, but in other uses. Okay, let's talk about the history of this herb. It's an interesting history. There's a lot of interesting history involving this herb. So a lot of this, and I'm going to be right up front, who had a great summary on all this was Wikipedia, which is not usually one of my favorite sources. So give it a grain of salt. There were a couple of these that said citations needed, so give it a grain of salt. But it had some interesting information here. So this is from Wikipedia. Some biblical commentators believe that the Sodom apple may have been the poisonous gourd or poison-tasting gourd that led to death in the pot in the second book of Kings, which is 2 Kings 4:38 through 41. In this story, a well-meaning servant of the prophet Elisha gathers herbs and a large quantity of the unknown gourds and casts them into the pot. After the outcry from the band of prophets, Elisha instructs them to cast flour into the stew pot, and they are saved. In 1938, botanists Hannah and Ephraim Ha-Reuveni speculated that Jeremiah's Arar or Aro-Ur, which is a tree or a bush, was the Sodom apple. So again, that's referring back to the Bible. The fiber of the Sodom apple may have been used for the linen of the high priests. That's interesting. It's said to be cotton-like and can be used in clothes. The fruit is described by the Roman Jewish historian Josephus, who saw it growing near what he calls Sodom, near the Dead Sea. And quote, as well as the ashes growing in their fruits, which fruits have a color as if they were fit to be eaten. But if you pluck them with your hands, they dissolve into smoke and ashes. Interesting. Sodom apple is listed in the Mishnah and Talmud, and these are the written, quote, oral laws interpreting various topics in the Torah. So these are basically the Jewish laws. The Torah, of course, being the Jewish Bible. And they say in there, the fibers attached to the seeds may have been used as wicks. They don't say there, but that is one of the options here, one of the things here. However, the Mishnah forbids this for the Sabbath. It may not be lighted with cedar bast, nor with uncombed flax, nor with floss silk, nor with willow fiber, nor with nettle fiber. And that's in Sabbath chapter 2 of the Mishnah. In his biblical researches in Palestine, American biblical scholar Edward Robinson describes it as the fruit of the Asclepias gigantivel procera, a tree 10 to 15 feet high with a grayish cork-like bark called osher by the Arabs. Again, remember I said usher, U-S-H-E-R, U-S-H-A-R, and this is osher, so very similar to that. Now, this is interesting. The Asclepias procera, remember, is one of the synonyms for Calotropis procera, which is our herb. But there's a related species, Calotropis giganti, which is not this plant. It's similar. It's in the same genera and similar, but it's not this plant, same species. And so here they're saying Asclepias giganti vel procera. So I think they kind of this biblical scholar matched the two species together, and I don't know if that's significant or not. But according to him, he says the fruit resembled a large smooth apple or orange hanging in clusters of 3 or 4. When pressed or struck, it explodes with a puff, like a bladder or puffball, leaving in the hand only the shreds of the thin rind and a few fibers. It is indeed filled chiefly with air, which gives it the round form, while in the center a small slender pod runs through it, which contains a small quantity of fine silk, which the Arabs collect and twist into matches for their guns. Interesting. Bedouins of the Sinai and Negev traditionally made use of the fibers of this plant for making skull caps or tagaya. I don't know how to pronounce that. T-A-G-I-Y-A-H. And there's still more history here. It's an interesting one. It has been the subject of poems and songs. John Milton alludes to this plant in his epic poem Paradise Lost, while describing the fruit that Satan and his cohorts eat after having tempted Adam and Eve to eat an apple from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And here's a quote for that. Greedy they plucked the fruitage fair to sight, like that which grew near that bituminous lake where Sodom flamed. This more delusive, not the touch, but taste, deceived they fondly thinking to allay their appetite with gust instead of fruit, chewed bitter ashes which the offended taste, with spattering noise rejected, oft they essayed, hunger and thirst constraining. It is from Book 10, 2, I'm assuming that's the passage, 520 to 528. That's the quote. Again, this is from Wikipedia. Take it with a little bit of a grain of salt. And this last one is a really interesting one as well. Marilyn Manson recorded a song named Apple of Sodom for the soundtrack album of the 1997 David Lynch film Lost Highway. So there you go. So that's another interesting historical bit on this herb. And that's it for the history of this herb. Let's talk a little bit about the non-medicinal uses of the apple of Sodom. According to Firm, a strong fiber is obtained from the stem, which is durable underwater. It's white, silky, strong, cylindrical, flexible, and durable stem fiber used for various purposes, such as making ropes, to form cheap cots, gunny bags, bowstrings, fishing nets, and in the manufacture of paper, pulp, and duplicating stencils. So lots of uses for this fiber. Strong inner bark fibers produce a binding material and are processed into fabrics. The floss from the seed capsules is used as a stuffing material in mattresses and other things. The floss from the seeds, which is about 2 to 3.5 centimeters long, so a little less than an inch to about an inch and a half, white, silky, and strong, is used as an inferior stuffing for mattresses and pillows, as well as for weaving into a strong cloth. The floss may also substitute cotton wool for surgical purposes. Interesting. The plant is the source of a rubber-like product called mutter gummy. The liquid latex can be used as a renewable source of hydrocarbons and intermediate energy resources. This latex contains 11 to 23% rubber, so that's a lot of rubber. Latex is 80% effective in inhibiting the activity of the tobacco mosaic virus. Interesting, which affects tobacco trees, but other plants as well. The leafy branches are said to deter ants. In a trial, a methane extract of the leaf at a concentration of 10,000 parts per million in distilled water reduced the egg hatching of root nematodes, or worms, by 97% after 21 days compared with a control. That's huge. A macerated bark extract can be used for dyes, an ideal plant for monitoring sulfur dioxide emissions in the air. Interesting. The stems are termite-proof and are used for roofing and building huts. The very light wood can be used for fishing net floats. The wood is a source of charcoal used for making gunpowder, and stems produce a good charcoal while the stem pith makes good tinder. A different source, Orwa and their team, adds the bark and latex are used in brewing and to curdle milk. The stems produce an effective and sustained smoky fire suitable for drying fish. White, silky, strong, cylindrical, flexible, and durable stem fiber are used for various purposes, such as making roots. This is basically the same. They must have gotten it from the same source. This is the same that I just mentioned earlier. A macerated bark extract can be used for dehairing hides and tanning. And the bark and the latex are widely used as arrow and spear poisons. The latex is cardiotoxic, with the active ingredient being calotropin. So this isn't, the cardiac glycosides, we don't think of calotropin as the ones that we use pharmaceutically, but I think this is where it has some of the same effects. And the cardiac glycosides, which are used to treat arrhythmias in pharmaceutical uses, is also considered a very, I don't want to say toxic, but has very strong adverse effects and is being used less and less because we have better drugs now than we used to. Though sometimes it's the only drug that can work, but it's a serious drug, the cardiac glycosides in general, not just these things here. Okay, let's talk about some of its traditional uses. The Apple of Sodom appears to have been used in many traditional societies around the world. Yogi and their team say traditional uses of this herb include using the whole plant to treat common diseases such as fever, rheumatism, indigestion, cold, eczema, diarrhea, for the treatment of boils, and for the treatment of jaundice. The root was used for the treatment of eczema, leprosy, elephantiasis, asthma, cough, rheumatism, and diarrhea. In case of diarrhea, it changed the fecal matter into a semi-solid mass within the first day of treatment. The stem was used for the treatment of skin diseases, intestinal worms, leprosy, and cure leukoderma, which is vitiligo. Verma had an exhaustive list of different parts of the herb and their traditional use in various parts of the world. Very similar, the whole plant was used to treat fever, rheumatism, indigestion, cold, eczema, diarrhea, boils, and jaundice. The root was used as a digestive agent to treat headache, severe body pain, malarial fever, eczema, leprosy, elephantiasis, asthma, cough, rheumatism, dysmenorrhea, which is painful menses, dysentery, and convulsion. The root bark was used to treat elephantiasis. If you're not familiar with elephantiasis, it's not a super common disease these days. I remember, I don't know, I was probably a teenager. There was a movie that came out called The Elephant Man, and it talked about someone who had elephantiasis, a very interesting condition. So definitely look that up if you're not familiar with it. So the root bark is used to treat that, leprosy, intestinal worms, indigestion, diarrhea, cholera, and dysentery. The stem is used to treat tuberculosis and vitiligo. The leaves are used to treat migraines, fever, headache, severe body pain, joint and waist pain. It said waist pain, but it may have meant wrist pain. So that's interesting. I'm not sure exactly. Asthma, cough, malarial fever, gout, flatulence, anorexia or lack of appetite, indigestion, skin diseases, and convulsion. The leaf latex is used to treat scorpion and snake bites, pain in any part of the body, and warts. The latex is used to treat, remember the latex is, the part that has the most of the cardiac glycosides, so we need to be careful with it. Latex is used to treat boils, cold, cough, asthma, toothache, earache, ringworm, eczema, skin eruptions and infections, inflammatory lesions, pain in the body, rheumatism, arthritis, syphilis, leprosy, rabies, cholera, dysentery, snake bites, and edema. And the flower is used to treat toothache, ringworm, malaria, fever, migraines, abdominal diseases, flatulence, anorexia, indigestion, intestinal worms, and asthma. So, you notice a lot of crossing over here of the different parts. So, it does seem like the different parts of this is used somewhat interchangeably or together at least. So interesting use of those. The PDR for herbal medicines also says it's used in Ayurvedic medicine. And this is a quote from them: the smoke or fumes from the bark is used for coughs and asthma and as a sudorific. A sudorific induces sweating. And I just want to say I was not able to confirm this use in any of the Ayurvedic texts in my library. And while searches on this herb said it was used in Ayurvedic medicine, there was no further information about its use. When they did talk about it at all, it appears to be part of Ayurvedic medicine and in Ayurvedic compounds, but not the most commonly used herb in Ayurvedic medicine. So from my research, used in Ayurvedic medicine, probably not commonly. Dosage and preparation for this. Dosing of the herb is difficult to determine as most sources generally describe its use without giving specific amounts to be used. That's not uncommon for an herb that hasn't been well tested clinically, and this has not been tested. I found nothing as far as evidence, clinical evidence. So we'll talk about that later. WebMD says the appropriate dose of Calotropis depends on several factors such as the user's age, health, and several other conditions. At this time, there is not enough scientific information to determine an appropriate range of doses for Calotropis. So that's from WebMD. I got a question here is, can I compare this latex with the latex shirts to wear? Yeah, these are different. So this is when we're talking about latex here, we're just talking about the latex that's secreted by the plant. Which is, and the latex in shirts and what have you are actually rubbery, sort of prepared industrial products. So very not at all the same. So we're talking about the latex from this herb, which is not the same thing as latex from other sources. So good question, thank you. The PDR for herbal medicine says as an expectorant and diaphoretic, so again, to induce sweating, 200 milligrams to 600 milligrams of this herb, and as an emetic, 2 grams to 4 grams. So an emetic is something that induces vomiting. And so here, that's an interesting one because that's not really something that was in the traditional uses. Sometimes I find the PDR for herbal medicines, which is relatively well researched, sometimes misses common usage of it. So I'd take that with a grain of salt. Okay, Chinese medical actions here. Search through several texts and an internet search did not yield any descriptions of this herb as a Chinese medicinal. So it has so many uses in many herbal traditions, it's difficult to determine its Chinese medical categories and actions, but I will try. So because it is often used as an anti-inflammatory and analgesic, it should have some blood-moving regulating action, as it has some antimicrobial properties and is used to treat boils and fevers. It appears to have the ability to treat heat toxin. In fact, that's probably where I'd put this herb, is in the heat toxin category. It is used to treat asthma, cough, and eczema, so it may have some release the exterior and treat wind cold activity. So there you go. I'm assuming it's on the warming side of things given, but if it treats heat toxin, I mean on the cooling side of things, so it actually would treat wind heat activity. I should change that here. Please keep in mind different parts of the plant have different activities, so these actions may or may not pertain to the whole herb. Content. So this is an interesting herb because, like I said, I found zero clinical research on this herb at all. All of it is traditional uses. I found a lot of research on rats, but nothing clinical, which means on humans. And yet its contents is pretty well delineated. It's pretty well established. So let's talk about some of the contents of this herb. Murdy and their team says ethanol extracts of the leaves contain sugars, phenols, flavonoids, steroids, terpenoids, tannins, and glycosides, while the water extracts include phenols, saponins, tannins, and glycosides. All of these can be, maybe not the sugars, but all of these can have medicinal properties to them. Fern says the latex contains a proteolytic enzyme called calotropis. So that is an interesting one. A proteolytic enzyme means it breaks down proteins, which is maybe one of the reasons why this is a little bit toxic. The latex is a little bit toxic, is it can actually break down our proteins a little bit. So I don't know. That's an interesting content here that I would like to know more about. There's a really good article by Dogara, discusses the uses of this herb and the constituents involved in those uses, or some of them anyways. We'll discuss this article in our next section on the science of this herb, where we'll list the scientific activities of the herb and the constituents that appear to be involved in that in those activities. Yogi and their team says the fresh flowers contain pentocyclic triterpenes such as calotropinil acetate and procesterol, as well as the antibiotic proceragenin, Genin at the end, proceragenin. They also discuss the presence of calotropinine, calactin, calotoxin, calotropin, this is really testing my tongue here. So traxasterol acetate, beta-sitosterol, which we've talked about quite a bit on Spur Herbs as a very common constituent in herbs, beta-sitosterol, and alpha and beta amarins in the leaves. The latex contains cardinolides such as calotropin, calotoxin, usharidin, and verucherin. The root contains ursinil acetate and proceranol. So there you go. That's a lot of verbiage. And we didn't get into a lot of it because we could spend days talking about all the different contents, and we're not gonna. We're gonna continue on. So let's get into the science of this herb. As I've been saying, there really aren't any clinical trials. So there's a lot of science on the constituents and ethnobotanist observations about this herb. So there's science around this herb, a lot of it, but not clinical science around this. So, and that's a distinction here. So basically, everything we're saying this herb doesn't have any evidence to support it. It's just been traditional uses. It's been observation. It's been research on the constituents and what those constituents can do. but there's nothing showing that it does those things in humans. And just because it can do those things in a rat or in a test tube does not translate into humans. It will have the same actions on humans. More often than not, it doesn't. Sometimes it does. More often than not, it doesn't. So let's start with that Dogara article that I mentioned earlier, which delved into specific constituents and their pharmacological actions. So this herb shows antioxidant properties. And here's a quote from that article. Flavanol, glycosides, cardinolides, and lignins have all been found in the latex of the species, all of which may contribute to its antioxidant properties. Active hydrogen donor ability of hydroxylated substitutions in calotropin, calotropin, and calotoxin may account for some of the plant's potential antioxidant properties. Anti-inflammatory activity. This was demonstrated in rat studies and bench research. Non-protein and protein components of latex are responsible for its anti-inflammatory effects. Again, that's a quote from that Dogara article. Antimicrobial, antifungal, and antihelmintic activity. Antihelmintic means anti-worms. And here's the quote. The latex of C. procera contains a wide variety of compounds, including procericide, proteolytic enzymes, cereogenin, I'm off that a little bit, cardinolides, carbohydrates, cardioactive glycosides, galactin, which include galactin, calotropane, calotoxin, and alkaloids, tannins, flavonoids, and procerain, a stable cysteine protease that may contribute to antibacterial activity. Fungi are inhibited by Calotropis procera in vitro, so in other words, in glass or in test tubes, probably more likely in I'm totally blanking on the name, in the trays, it'll come to me. The effectiveness in the treatment of fungal infections, however, has not been demonstrated in clinical trials. Continuing with that, when helminths are exposed or worms are exposed to either fresh or aqueous extracts of dried latex, both spontaneous motility, so that's movement, in other words, paralysis, and pin-evoked responses, I don't know what a pin-evoked response is, were reduced in a dose-dependent manner. In other words, the more that was given, the more the reduction happened. It has antidiarrheal activity. More evidence is required to support this activity, with only a singular rat study supporting this use. Antimalarial activity, ethanolic, which means alcohol, extracts of the flowers, buds, and roots, showed in vitro inhibition of P. falciparum. P. falciparum plasmodium falciparum is one of the main malaria bugs. Is probably the most common of the malaria bugs. There's a few others, species, but that's the big one. Anti-diabetic activity, chronic administration of Calotropis procera root methanol, stem methanol, and leaf ethyl acetate extracts resulted in a substantial reduction in mechanical hyperalgesia, thermal hyperalgesia, tactile allodynia, and HbA1c percent level in diabetic rats. Okay, so hyperalgesia means pain, so reduction in mechanical pain, thermal pain. Tactile allodynia is also a form of pain. All that's pain stuff, but that has nothing to do with antidiabetics. But at HbA1c, which is hemoglobin A1c, that's a really important marker of long-term sugar damage. And so if that reduces, that is definitely an issue, and it definitely supports anti-diabetic, but it's rats again, so anti-diabetic in diabetic rats. It has wound healing activity. The wound size was reduced as a result of the latex's stimulation of collagen, DNA and protein synthesis, and epithelialization in rats. Epithelialization means the growth of skin, basically, in rats. Again, rat studies. Hepatoprotective activity or liver protective activity. A rat study demonstrated that Calotropis procera has a hepatoprotective effect against isoniazid and rifampicin administration, protecting the liver from long-term toxicity. Okay, interesting. It has anti-ulcer activity. Again, another singular rat study showed some positive effects on ulcers. Okay. Anti-cancer activity. A couple of rat studies showed cancer protection when dosed with a C. procera extract. So there you go. Lots of different potential uses for it. Again, rat studies just show potential. I do not think there's any evidence that this is something that we should do. I think there's a lot of evidence to say we should do more research on this herb. I think it's really interesting. I'd love to see more research on this herb, but it's not an herb I'm going to recommend to my patients, that's for sure. Not that it's widely available. Let's talk about drug-herb interactions. A search for drug-herb interactions with Calotropis procera yielded no results. However, WebMD did have several D-level cautions. So D-level is the lowest level of evidence, and it's basically kind of boiled down to expert opinion. There wasn't any evidence to show that these were drug-herb interactions, but I think in this case, probably take it, take it with a grain of salt, but also take it, this is known to be a bit toxic, so I definitely would listen here. And here's what they came up with. They said, taking Calotropis procera along with digoxin, which is a cardiac glycoside, can increase the effects of digoxin and increase the risk of side effects. Calotropis may have a diuretic effect, in other words, promoting urination, and decrease the excretion of lithium. So lithium is used as an anti-manic, so it's helped for mania. So this can increase the lithium levels in the body and increase the possibility of serious adverse effects. It's particularly important with lithium. Lithium has what we call a narrow therapeutic index, which means that it's any differences in dosing can cause toxic effects, and it doesn't have a lot of safety margin in dosing. So anything that affects it can be serious. So that's an issue. And diuretics can increase potassium levels in the body, and low potassium can increase the possibility of adverse effects from Calotropis procera. Sorry, I said increase potassium, I meant decrease potassium. So diuretics can decrease potassium levels, and so low potassium can increase adverse effects from this herb. And finally, they say stimulant laxatives can decrease potassium levels in the body, and low potassium can increase the possibility of adverse effects from Calotropis procera. Potassium is very well controlled. Levels are very well controlled. And if something kind of throws them out of whack, it can be rapidly life-threatening. So definitely an issue with these sort of herbs. But again, expert opinion, not evidence. These stimulant laxatives include bisacodyl, cascara, castor oil, and senna. We're familiar in Chinese medicine with senna leaves, senna folium, which is a Chinese herb, and that is a strong laxative. And finally, for drug-herb interactions, the American Herbal Products Association's Botanical Safety Handbook by Gardner and McGuffin does not have an entry for this herb. So I mention that because it's a thick book. It has a lot of entries. It's about as thick. I'm looking at it. Yeah, it's very similar to the PDR for herbal medicines, which did have an entry on this. But usually when the Herbal Products Botanical Safety Handbook does not have an entry, it means it's a more obscure herb. So that's part of the reason why I mention it here. Concerns. We definitely have concerns for this herb. Because of the cardiac glycosides in the contents of this herb, it is considered to be quite toxic and should be used cautiously. The PDR for herbal medicine says this drug is highly toxic. Higher doses cause vomiting, diarrhea, and bradycardia, which is slow heartbeat, and convulsions. Very high doses may cause death. Okay, very high doses causing death. Name most drugs, very high doses will cause death. So as long as we control doses, I'm not worried about that, but still we need to be concerned to a certain extent. WebMD agrees, saying when taken by mouth, Calotropis is likely unsafe, especially in high doses. It contains chemicals that can interfere with heart function. Those are those cardiac glycosides. It can cause serious side effects, including vomiting, diarrhea, slow heartbeat, convulsions, and death. They also say pregnancy and breastfeeding is likely unsafe. To use Calotropis when pregnant or breastfeeding, avoid use. Now, Dagara had some actual interesting safety trials, but they were all in rats again. So here's what they say, what he says. Up to 3 grams per kilograms of the leaf extract was safe. None of the treated animal groups demonstrated any evidence of morbidity or altered behavior during the course of a trial. Histological alterations in the testes of treated rats were attributed to the same cardiac glycosides and C. procera latex extract that were previously linked to pathological and ultrastructural kidney tubule changes in Worcester rats. Okay, so that's interesting. In other words, they found some, but they're kind of normal in Worcester rats. I had to look up Worcester rats. Worcester rats are a strain of rats. They're the most commonly used rats in research, and they've been around since the early 1900s. So very commonly used. So that's all they are. Laboratory rats, fairly standardized. That's why they're used. The results of a different study suggest that using latex extract in excess could have toxicological effects. As a result, only minimal amounts should be used. So the latex seems to be the biggest issue with this, but I'd still be a little bit cautious overall. Okay, wow, that was good. Timing's good. Summary here, we started our discussion today, continuing our conversation about the Chinese medical pulse, discussing the first 6 basic pulse qualities. From there, we did our deep dive into Apple of Sodom, or Calotropis procera, and we discovered an herb with a very interesting history extending to the Bible, with some widespread and interesting uses with little to no clinical proof other than various herbal traditions. I'm not discounting those herbal traditions. I just, given the toxicity of this herb, I want more than just it's been used, in this particular way for a while. And we found it potentially can be a very toxic herb. Overall, a very interesting herb with quite some potential, but we need a lot more evidence before its efficacy and its safety. About both of its, we need a lot more evidence about both its efficacy and its safety. In our next episode, we will be exploring one of the most commonly used Chinese herbs, though for most people outside of Chinese medicine is virtually unknown, Fuling or Poria. I love this herb, and I love it for one reason. It is so commonly used in Chinese medicine, and again, people just don't know about it. I remember I was driving with a bunch of my medical school buddies as well. We were in medical school, and in the back seat I had my herbal book, and they said, "Oh, you know this?" I'm like, "Yeah, I know most of it. You can test me, tell me any herb, pick out an herb." And they said, they flipped to a page, like, "No, he'll know that." And he flipped to another page, like, "Yeah, this is it." They go very haughtily, they go, "Tell us about Fu Ling." And I was able, because it's such a common herb, I was able to rattle off everything right, left, and center. It was so easy, and they're just like, their jaws dropped, and they're like, "Holy crap, you know your stuff." So love the herb. He never told them that if they had done a more obscure herb, I would not have known as much about it. But word for word, what was in there, I could spew it off because it's so common. So this obviously is a very commonly used herb in Chinese medicine for promoting urination and draining dampness. Basically, it is often considered an herbal diuretic. I don't like that herb to Western, to pharmaceutical equation, but that's often how it's described. Plus, it also helps digestion, supports the spleen, and quiets the heart and calms the spirit. What cool effects. And as usual, we will be exploring something a little different. Please join us for this next episode. I'm just going to say it, foundational and critical episode coming up in our next episode. Thank you. And thank you. If you like this podcast, please do us a huge favor. Give us a 5-star rating in your favorite podcast app. We're on all the podcast apps. We would really appreciate it. Thank you so much for even thinking about giving us a 5 stars in our podcast app. And remember, you can get CEUs in continuing education units and National Certification Commission of Acupuncture and Oriental Medicine, NCCAOM, PDAs or professional development activities. at www.integrativemedicinecouncil.org. That's Integrative Medicine Council, COUNCIL.org. And you can always get in touch with me at Dr. Greg at spurbsherbs.com. That's SPERBSHERBS.com. Or at our website, www.spurbsherbs.com. And as usual, we have our bibliography. Thank you.
Spurbs Herbs.
The proceeding was presented by Dr. Greg Sperber. We would like to thank Janelle for all her support and everybody else who contributed to this program.
Janelle.
Timothy
Thompson.
Dobbins.
Rogers.
Campbell.